So I think we will start with Lichtenberg.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, thank you to the Platypus Society for inviting me. I assume the invitation implies that you think I have something meaningful to contribute, so I will try to live up to those expectations. And special welcome to the young revolutionary in the back. Always good to see some youth present. So I will talk briefly about the split between the anarchists and the Marxists historically, then talk about what I see as an important historical event that holds some lessons for us, the Russian Revolution, and finish with some remarks about the Spanish Revolution, and in particular what I see as the problems of anarchism in practice. All of this in 12 minutes. But before I go into the actual presentation, I try to clarify what I mean by some of the words so that we're roughly on the same page, or I help with that. When I think of Marxism and anarchism, I think of two tendencies within the workers' movement, both of which see themselves as revolutionary as opposed to the tendency that is known as social democracy, which would work through reforms in parliament. When I think of Marxism, I think this word is interchangeable with Leninism or Trotskyism. I do not associate with it things like Maoism or Stalinism. When I think of anarchism in its best representation, in my view, as a former anarchist, as exemplified by people like Bakunin, Kropotkin, or anarcho-syndicalism. And I think there are some commonalities between the two tendencies. I just want to highlight three of them. I think Marxism and anarchism agree on the need for the liberation of humanity through the destruction of capitalism. I also think that we agree on the fact that there's a class struggle going on between the exploiters and the exploited. And finally, I think that we agree on the need to destroy the existing oppressive capitalist state structure. What happens after that is where we diverge, I think, but I think we agree on the first part of the state question. So, the historical differences, and I am very aware that I'm very brief on this. The anarchists, led by Bakunin, a Russian revolutionary, affiliated to what became known as the First International, an international workers' organization led by Marx and Engels. They were part of that. But the conflict really began with the creation of the Alliance of Socialist Democracy, which was founded by Bakunin and his followers. And what it meant was that they maintained a somewhat secret organization within the First International, and also started to publish articles that were critical of Marx. So there was a lot of going back and forth over organizational matters, but as with every organizational dispute, at the heart of it is really politics. And the difference in politics between the Marxists and the anarchists really came to the fore at the 1872 Congress of the International in The Hague in the Netherlands, when there was a big debate between the Bakunian faction and the Marx followers about the role of the state in the transformation towards socialism. The Marxists argued that there was a role for the state in the transformation towards socialism, while the followers of Bakunin insisted that the state should be immediately replaced by self-governing workplaces and communes. The Bakunin faction lost that debate, and as part of the organizational wrangling that was going on, the Bakunin followers were actually expelled from the First International for maintaining that secret organization that I had mentioned earlier. So that was the historical split in a nutshell. A few years later, by 1880, Kropotkin, another Russian revolutionary, announced the need for the permanent revolt through word, gun, and dynamite, which really set off the anarchists, particularly in Russia, on the course of anarchist terrorism, which really removed the anarchists from the masses, and they isolated themselves very much, in my view, through these practices. The event that really is key, I think, to understanding revolution, and what in my view still holds a lesson, is the Russian Revolution, which happened, the October Revolution in 1917. Now, The second international, another international body that followed, collapsed basically in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War, because the different sections of the international ended up supporting their own government in their war efforts. So rather than being internationalists, they sided with their own national governments, which Lenin, the Russian revolutionary who led the Bolsheviks, identified as a complete disaster and betrayal of the spirit of socialism and internationalism. And his main learning from that collapse of the Second International was that he propagated the need for the revolutionaries to set up a separate organization from the reformists. He said we need to have our own organization with our own aims, and therefore he advocated the need for a vanguard party, you could say. So he was the theoretical and practical leader of this concept, which I think is still valid today. So the Bolsheviks, the Russian organization that followed Lenin, they built a party of this type. They built a party that was democratic centralist, which meant that there was free discussion within the organization, a democratic debate, and there was a vote taken. But once that decision had been made, the decision was binding on all the members to carry out that decision, whether they originally agreed with the direction or not. The need for it was there because they needed to get something done. They needed to get a social revolution accomplished. And they needed a disciplined organization that was ready in order to carry out that task. So, over time, the Bolsheviks managed to attract the best elements of Russian society, workers and peasants, to their program. Their program reflected the immediate needs of the peasants and focused on the revolutionary potential of the working class. And I think most importantly, the Bolsheviks distinguished themselves from other tendencies because they actually told the masses the truth. Whether that was popular at the time or not, they would not waver, they would not seek the line of least resistance. They would tell it as it is. And that allowed them over time for the workers to gain confidence in them, because they were the ones who told them the truth about the Tsar and bourgeois democracy and the war that was going on. So they gained the support of the workers, as was reflected in having the majorities in the Soviets in Moscow and Petrograd, the Soviets being workers' assemblies or workers' councils, where workers and soldiers would meet and discuss how to proceed. That was even before the October Revolution. So they gained the majority there and really had the backing of the working class, which was, by the way, a very small section within the overall Russian society. They carried out the October Revolution, which was an armed uprising in 1917, and cleared out the weak government, actually with very little resistance, because the regime was so poor and so lacking in support that the initial reaction was mainly the crumbling of the regime. So the difference, of course, with anarchists is that anarchists will say it is bad to set up a state as the Soviets did, and that leads to renewed oppression. But I think that the state exists as long as class divisions exist, as long as people are divided into different classes in society. So I think you fundamentally have initially the choice of either having a bourgeois state, the kind of state we have in Canada today, or in the US, or in Germany, which is a state that serves the interest of the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, the rich and powerful, or you can establish through a revolution a state that is what I call a worker state, that is built on a different premise and that seeks to advance the interests of the workers and protects the new society from counterattacks by the old ruling class. Now, I am a communist, and as such I would like to see a state when there is no state. But that can only happen when the class divisions have been eliminated, when generalized want is eliminated. And in order to get there, we need a substantial development of the means of production. So it's not a moral question or what would be nicer to have, but it is one that is grounded in economic realities, I believe. How much time do I have left?
We've got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. Okay. So in 2 minutes, the Spanish Revolution. In 1936, a Popular Front government was elected in Spain. This scared the shit out of the bourgeoisie and the landowners, and General Franco launched a coup. He tried to seize power in order to protect the interests of the wealthy. The workers responded and seized the barracks, often in heroic battles where unarmed workers would take over barracks of the army and arm themselves in order to defend what was a developing social revolution. And the anarcho-syndicalist organization in Spain was extremely strong and powerful. The CNT-FAI was a mass organization of Spanish workers. And really, they began to dominate economic life through workers' committees at that time. They were running production and distribution through the anarcho-syndicalist organization. And the armed conflict with the forces of Franco escalated. So here is what I think is a tragic lesson. The CNT de facto held power in Spain through the workers' committees. But because they were anarchists or influenced by the ideas of anarchism, they refused to assume power. They did not want to become rulers of society. They didn't want to run the state because that was in conflict with their beliefs. So what happened? The old bourgeoisie continued to run the state, and they continued to run affairs when in reality they had nearly been defeated. But the CNT, through their anarchist morals, basically handed the power back to the bourgeoisie. To me, that is terrible and a tragedy, because the CNT could have pushed forward, but because they tried to adhere to the anarchist principles, they basically missed a huge opportunity, in my opinion. And they then actually ended up joining governments in Spain in joint coalitions with the Communist Party of the Stalinists and bourgeois parties. They continued to work with them and wage a war against Franco, which eventually was lost. And again, the reason why it was lost is because the anarchists maintained an alliance with the bourgeoisie in the fight against Franco. And because they didn't want to scare away their partners, they did not advocate social revolution. But the need for social revolution was there, and this is something that should have been pushed forward at the time. But the anarchists, in order to maintain their alliance, took that really off the agenda together with the communists. So for me, it is a tragedy because the CNT held power, but refused to do anything with it. And the only people who benefited from it were the reactionaries, was the old ruling class. That to me was a lesson that actually was one of the reasons why I moved from being an anarchist to becoming a Marxist. Because once I had investigated that issue, I began to understand that there is something wrong with the theory of anarchism as it then translates into practice. And I guess that is my time.